Welcome back to the Consistent Underwater Edit. In this sixth lesson, we will be looking at masking. Masking is powerful, but it is not where we begin. By this point, white balance, exposure, presence, and color should already be working. Now we ask one question: is the problem global or local? If it is local, masking helps us isolate it without disturbing the rest of the photograph. Scope first, tool second. Before we choose any masking tool, we need to slow down and diagnose the scope of the problem. On the next slide, we will look at one question that decides whether you should mask or go back to an earlier step. Before you create a mask, ask one question. Is the problem affecting the entire photograph or only one specific area? If the whole image is too blue, go back to white balance. If the entire photograph is too dark or too bright, revisit exposure. If the image still feels flat, reconsider presence. If the color throughout the photograph looks too intense or unnatural, go back to color. But if most of the photograph is already working and only one area still needs attention, that is when masking becomes appropriate. Once you know the problem is local, the next goal is to protect everything else that is already working. Imagine that your global adjustments are finished. The water has the color and depth you want. The overall exposure feels balanced. The subject has got good presence and colors look natural. But one area still needs attention. If you make another global adjustment, you may improve that area while changing the water, background, or other parts of the photograph that were already working. That is where a local adjustment makes sense. A mask lets you isolate the area that still needs work while protecting everything else. Don't change the entire photograph to fix one part of it. And underwater photographs often give us several very different areas that may need different treatment. Underwater photographs often contain several very different lighting and color conditions in the same frame. A foreground lit by strobes can behave very differently from the blue water behind it. A diver's face may need different treatment from the surrounding water. A fish may be correctly exposed while part of the reef behind it is distracting. And a wreck can contain both bright and shadowed areas that should not all be treated the same way. That is why masking is so useful this late in the workflow. The question is not whether you can create a mask. The question is, does this area need something different from the rest of the photograph? Let's look at a few common situations where the answer to the question is yes. Here are several common underwater situations where a local adjustment makes sense. Maybe the subject looks good overall, but a turtle, fish, or diver needs a little more separation from the background. Maybe the foreground is lit by strobes while the water behind it is mostly ambient light, so those two areas need different treatments. Maybe a diver's face still looks wrong even though the overall color is working. Or maybe one part of the reef, wreck, or background is pulling too much attention away from the subject. In each of these cases, the photograph is mostly working. The problem is limited to one area. That is exactly where masking earns its place in the workflow. But this is also where masking can become a trap if we use it to avoid fixing an earlier global decision. Let's look at where masking can become a trap. Modern masking tools make it easy to create increasingly complex selections, but that does not mean the photograph needs them. If you find yourself building mask after mask just to make the image work, stop and ask, am I trying to correct a global problem locally? If most of the photograph is too blue, return to white balance. If the entire image is too dark or too bright, revisit exposure. If the whole photograph still feels flat, reconsider presence. If color throughout the image looks unrealistic or overdone, go back to color. A complicated masking structure can sometimes be a sign that an earlier decision in the workflow needs another look. Masking should make the edit more precise, not compensate for a weak foundation. Now let's look at one of the most common local problems underwater photographers face: backscatter. Backscatter is a good example of why we need to think locally. If only a few distracting particles appear around the subject or in one section of the frame, you do not want to change the entire photograph just to deal with them. The rest of the image may already be working. This is where a local approach makes sense. The important point is not the specific tool you use. The important point is recognizing that the problem is still limited to one area, so the correction should be limited too. That keeps the rest of the photograph protected. And this is exactly why masking belongs after the global foundation is already established. That brings us back to the decision framework we use throughout this entire system. Diagnose, decide, move on. Masking fits directly into the decision-making framework we have been using throughout this series. Diagnose, decide, move on. First, diagnose the problem. Ask what still looks wrong, and more importantly, where is the problem? Is it affecting the entire photograph or only one specific area? Then decide. If the problem is global, return to the appropriate earlier step. If the problem is local, isolate only what needs attention and use the simplest mask that solves it. Then move on. Once the local problem is corrected, stop. You do not need another mask simply because Lightroom gives you the ability to create one. And that leads to an important reminder. The goal is not to create more masks. A successful underwater edit is not measured by how many masks you create. Sometimes a photograph may need several. Sometimes it may need one. And sometimes it may not need masking at all. The goal is to identify what the photograph actually needs and make only the adjustments that help you get there. A clear sequence helps us determine where the problem belongs before we decide how to fix it. That is what makes masking valuable at this stage of the workflow. A global photograph is already working. Now we are simply refining the areas that need individual attention. So before we finish, let's bring the entire lesson down to one simple rule you can use on every underwater photograph. If you remember only one idea from this lesson, make it this: scope first, tool second. Before you open the masking panel, decide whether the problem affects the entire photograph or only one part of it. If the problem is global, go back to the appropriate earlier step. If the problem is local, masking may be the exact right tool. That simple decision helps you avoid unnecessary masks, protects parts of the photograph that are already working, and keeps your editing process moving forward. Masking should isolate, not rescue. That is the role of masking in the consistent underwater editing system. And with masking complete, there's only one step left in the workflow: final adjustments. Masking is step 5 in the consistent underwater editing system. By this point, the global foundation should be working, and any remaining local problems should be handled. That leaves one final step: final adjustments. This is where we polish the photograph without reopening decisions we have already made. In the next lesson, we will look at how final adjustments should refine an already successful edit, not restart it. And remember, white balance, exposure, presence, color, masking, final adjustments. Diagnose, decide, move on. Until next time, dive smart, shoot with purpose, and edit with intention.